There's a type of person who does everything right, never misses mass, knows the catechism, volunteers, shows up. And if you ask them about their faith, they'd describe it confidently, the beliefs, the practices, the tradition they belong to. Jesus ran into this type constantly, and his interactions with them were, to put it mildly, not what those people expected. Because what Jesus kept pointing at wasn't the visible layer, the practices, the knowledge, the track record. It was something underneath all of that, something that either is or isn't there, and that no amount of external correctness can substitute for. That's what these 7 signs are about. Not a verdict on anyone's faith, more like a flashlight pointed at a few specific places where religion and actual relationship with Jesus tend to quietly diverge. Some of these will feel obvious. 1 or 2 might catch you off guard. Either way, let's get into it. Sign 1. Your faith is primarily a system for keeping yourself in line. Nothing wrong with wanting to live well, that's the point. But there's a version of Christianity that actually reduces itself to moral accounting. Don't do these things. Do these other things. Maintain the score. And as long as the score looks acceptable, the relationship with God is assumed to be fine. The problem is that Jesus kept pushing past the external layer entirely. The Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 through 7, is essentially him moving the conversation inward again and again. It's not enough to act right. What's driving the action? What's actually happening underneath? He wasn't interested in people who had the outside dialed in while the inside stayed untouched. That's not a harsh reading of him, it's just what the text shows. Religion manages behavior. Relationship changes what you actually want. And those 2 things can look identical from the outside for a very long time. Sign 2. You're more comfortable with rules than with mystery. Rules are satisfying in a way that mystery isn't. A rule tells you where you stand. Mystery requires you to keep showing up without knowing exactly where things are going. One pattern that tends to show up in religion as system is a strong preference for clarity over encounter. Give me the definitive answer on this theological question. Tell me exactly which practices are required and which are optional. Draw the boundary precisely so I know which side I'm on. None of that is entirely wrong. Doctrine matters. Precision in theology matters. But when the need for total clarity starts crowding out the capacity for wonder, when every question has to be resolved before you'll engage with it, something has shifted. The disciples, for most of their time with Jesus, had no idea what was happening. They misunderstood his parables. They argued about the wrong things. They fell asleep in Gethsemane, and he kept working with them anyway, not because they had the right framework, but because they kept showing up. A faith that only functions when all the questions are answered is a more fragile thing than it appears. Sign 3. Your generosity has an audience. This one is short because Jesus made it short. Matthew 6:1. Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. He was not subtle about it. The giving that needs to be witnessed, the prayer that happens loudest when others are watching. The sacrifice mentioned in a way that ensures people know about it. The diagnostic question here isn't whether anyone sees your generosity. Sometimes people will, and that's fine. It's whether the audience changes the decision, whether the thing would happen the same way if nobody ever knew. Because the moment it depends on being seen, it's not coming from the same place anymore. Sign 4. You find it easier to judge than to be curious about people. Jesus was relentlessly interested in people who should have been easy write-offs by the religious standards of his time. Zacchaeus, a tax collector, which in first century Judea meant collaborator with Roman occupation, the Samaritan woman at the well, the Roman centurion. He didn't approach any of them with the conclusion already formed. He engaged them like people with a story he actually wanted to hear. The Pharisees had a different approach. They had a finely tuned system for placing people quickly, who's in, who's out, who's worth the conversation. And it worked efficiently. It just didn't look anything like what Jesus was doing. The tell isn't whether you hold firm convictions about how life should be lived. Most serious Christians do, and that's not the problem. The tell is what happens in the first few seconds when you encounter someone whose life looks very different from yours. Whether the first movement is toward understanding how they got there or toward filing them somewhere. Curiosity and compromise are not the same thing. Jesus managed both at once constantly. Most of us pick one and call it faithfulness. Sign 5. Your God gets smaller when life gets harder. This is the one that cuts the deepest for me, so I want to spend a little more time here. See, when we treat religion like a system, we're usually buying into an implicit promise. Follow the rules, keep up the practices, and things will hold together. Not necessarily on the outside, we're smarter than that, but on the inside. We expect our peace to stay and our doubts to fade. We expect to feel steady. And then something actually hard happens. A loss, a failure, or prayers that stay unanswered for so long that the silence starts to feel like an answer. That's when the system cracks, because deep down we built it on the idea that following God should make sense. I've seen it go one of two ways. For some of us, the pain actually brings us closer. Not because it's easy, but because the comfortable version of our faith falls apart, and we're left with something that finally feels real. But for others, it's the opposite. It shows us that what we had wasn't actually that deep. We were following a God who was predictable, someone who made sure things went right if we did the right things. And when that stops happening, we don't know what to do with him anymore. Our version of God only worked when life made sense. That's basically Job's story. He was a good man, and then his world falls apart, not because he messed up, but just because he suffered. His friends spend the whole time trying to explain it away. You must have sinned. There has to be a reason. This doesn't happen to people who do things right. They weren't trying to help Job, they were trying to save their system. But at the end of the story, God corrects them, not Job, even though he was the one arguing and questioning and being brutally honest. I think the faith that holds up when things get dark isn't the one that has everything figured out. It's the one that was real to begin with. Sign 6. You read scripture to confirm, not to be challenged. There's a particular reading habit that shows up when faith has settled into a system. You go to scripture already knowing what you're going to find. Not in the sense of theological conviction, holding firm on what you believe is not the problem, but in the sense that the parts of the text that press against your comfort zones get conveniently minimized, while the parts that confirm your existing positions get highlighted, memorized, shared. The early church fathers, Origen in the 3rd century, Augustine in the 4th, both wrote about the danger of reading scripture in a way that only ever produces agreement with yourself. Augustine, in De Doctrina Christiana, argued that if a reading of scripture doesn't increase your love for God and neighbor, the interpretation needs to be revisited, regardless of how theologically tidy it seems. The Bible has a way of being inconvenient when you let it be. The passages about wealth are uncomfortable if you have some. The passages about enemies are uncomfortable if you have any. The passages about forgiveness have a specificity that the general idea of forgiveness doesn't require. A scripture that only ever agrees with you is a mirror, not a window. Sign 7. Your faith doesn't change how you treat people on ordinary days. Last one, and arguably the simplest. James 1:27 describes religion that God considers pure and faultless as this: looking after orphans and widows in their distress and keeping oneself from being polluted by the world. It's strikingly practical. Not a doctrinal statement, not a liturgical requirement. Two things, one about how you treat vulnerable people, one about interior integrity. The test Jesus returns to most consistently is not theological precision, it's fruit. By their fruit you will recognize them, Matthew 7:16. Not by their stated beliefs, not by their church attendance, by what their life actually produces in the people around them. So the simplest test is this. Do the people in your life, the ones who see you at your most ordinary, feel any different because of your faith? It shouldn't be a performance. It should just be the reality of how you show up for the people who know you best. Religion can be entirely sincere and still not reach that far. It can be doctrinally correct, liturgically faithful, behaviorally respectable, and still not have much effect on how you listen to someone who's struggling, how you respond when you're overlooked, how you treat people who can do nothing for you. That gap between the faith that's professed and the faith that shows up in the middle of regular life is where the question of religion versus relationship actually lives. None of these 7 are a final diagnosis. Most people who've been in faith for any length of time will recognize themselves somewhere in this list, not because they've failed, but because the drift from relationship toward religion is genuinely easy. It happens in the small decisions, across a long time, in the direction of what's comfortable and manageable. The good news, and this is actually good news, is that the same Jesus who called out the Pharisees also sat down to eat with them when they invited him. Nicodemus came to him in the dark, confused and entrenched in his religious system, and got one of the longest theological conversations in the Gospel of John. The invitation has always been to the person underneath the system, not after you've fixed it. Now, we've all got gaps between what we say we believe and how we show up in regular life. Which of these signs helped you see that gap a little more clearly today? You can leave it in the comments if you want. I'll see you in the next one.